My name is Dovie. All my life, people have said, "Oh, that's so cute." And then they ask, "What's it short for?" I never had an answer to that. And when I was just a little girl going out into the world, leaving my family for the first time to walk 2 miles to school, that was the first question I heard. And I was small. I had no answer. And I was shy. I would just say, it's my grandma's name. She's Apache. It's an old name. And as soon as I said the word Apache, that would have them off and thinking about cowboys and Indians they'd seen in westerns Saturday mornings on TV, and I could escape. A lot of school I spent escaping. Now, this was Texas in the 50s. Now, I know I'm in Canada, so I don't expect you to groan, or perhaps you're simply too polite. But let me tell you, being indigenous, whatever you call it, and they sure didn't use that word, in Texas in the 50s, In Texas in the 50s, the first thing I learned about Indian people is that we were extinct. Yeah, that was my greeting to school. Good morning, boys and girls. You over there, you don't exist. Now, today we're going to be. It was also the first time my name was challenged. I was told that it wasn't a proper name. It sounded a bit like a nickname. It surely wasn't a Christian name. And she would have none of that in her classroom. A classroom is a formal, respectful place, and we will use proper names. So she called me David. Until my dad, who is a 6'5", blue-eyed thunderstorm, a Scottish gypsy and Apache, had a conference with the principal of the school. And suddenly I was Dovie in the classroom. But that didn't stop the little boys whose fathers were part of the dove hunters of Texas. They were the future dove hunters of Texas. There actually is an annual dove hunt in Texas where they just kill as many doves as they possibly can, big men with big guns killing little birds. And their sons tormented me during recess. I would run and run, hearing behind me calls of Pocahontas, Little White Dove, Bird Girl, until I would maybe prove them right. I was only thinking of survival when I climbed the pecan trees' low branches out of their reach. I didn't like school. I liked to stay with my grandma. Now, at school, I had won the right to be called Dovie, but at home, I was never called Dovie. There was only one Dovie. That was Grandma Dovie. Everybody called her Ms. Dovie. Some folks, well, most of them, Ms. Guthrie, but Ms. Dovie. And she was my best friend. I would spend every weekend I could alone with her. I am the oldest girl in a family of 9, so time alone, just me and my grandma, was precious. She lived in a little white clapboard house outside of old Fort Worth. Fort Worth at a time where they were still running cattle through the streets to the stockyards. And her little clapboard house was a neat little place that always smells like roses. Roses blooming all around in that dry climate, blooming all around her house and inside too, because Grandma didn't waste anything. And when the roses were through blooming, she'd take their petals and gather them up, and she'd make rose water to rub into her skin, rose water that permeated her house. She would say that a woman needed to know how to work hard, but that her hands shouldn't feel like it. Rose water, soften the skin. I smell it now, and I'm back in that house. We weren't in the house all the time, Grandma and I. She liked to spend a lot of her time outside. You see, she had a brush arbor in the back, what the Spanish called a ramada, a brush arbor, like our people have had forever in that hot climate to give you a little shade during ceremonies and dances and feasts. And Grandma had a little one in her backyard, and sitting in the middle of it was an old wood stove. That's where she did most of her cooking, certainly summertime. That's where she cooked. Grandma would always say, and forgive me, it is a direct quote, "White people are crazy." Sometimes she would not call them white people. Sometimes she just called all white people Americans. She couldn't keep up with the geography and the treaties, I guess. She wasn't sure what boundaries and borders we were living within. She said they were crazy because they'd build a house in a hot place and then they'd put a stove inside. And in the middle of summer, they'd turn that stove up to 300-400 degrees to cook something. Grandma thought that made no sense at all. She had a wood stove out in her shade arbor, and that's where she'd cook in the summer. Hollyhocks, those old hollyhocks that grow 6-7 feet taller than my dad, would just circle her shade arbor. Bees buzzing in and out of those blossoms over my head as I'd sit in the arbor, hearing those bees, smelling that smoke and smelling something, always something simmering, usually something with chilies in it, simmering on an old cast iron pan on that wood stove. And Grandma's voice. We'd sit out there mornings and evenings, and she'd tell me stories. Often stories of the animal people. The animal people, some of them so clever, so wise, so foolish, so naughty, doing impossible things and getting away with it till they didn't. Animals pulling stunts and misbehaving in ways that were familiar to me and that I thought had not been observed. Animals acting like I was, and stories to gently, gently address my behavior with no confrontation at all. I thought she made them all up. I didn't know they'd been told to her when she was a naughty child my age. I didn't know they were stories she had remembered and translated from Apache to English with just 4 years of forced education at an Oklahoma mission school. And she turned those stories she'd heard from her own grandma into English so she could tell them to another generation of children who needed them. They weren't all our stories. They were the stories of lonely children, talking at night in forbidden languages. And so later and later I learned how many of those stories she told me were stories from many nations, learned in her childhood at that school in Lawton. One day I was sitting in the arbor with her. I don't remember a story, so I guess I'd been being good. But sometimes the stories were loaded up front, like an inoculation as you're going on a journey, just to keep you safe, vaccinate you before you go. Before I went out in life, something that might save me some hardship or hurt along the way. But on this day, I just remember sitting in the arbor with Grandma. I was sitting in the arbor with Grandma on that day, and it was quiet. There was a dove sitting on a telephone wire, just calling the way they do. And Grandma stopped, and her face just turned up toward that sound, and her head cocked much like a bird as she listened to that call. And then she turned to me and said, "Listen to her. Listen to her. She's going to cry and cry all sad-like till someone answers. and she knows her family's okay. Well, that's when I got the answer to that question that still shows up far too often in my life. Dovie, what's that short for? Here's my answer. Nothing. It's long for dove. That's who we were. Me and my grandma, doves. We look after our family. Me and my grandma, we'll cry and cry, all sad like, till we know they're okay. That's who my grandma had been. After she passed, my dad gave me a picture of her. I knew she'd passed because when he called me far away, calling me from Texas, where I was somewhere on the East Coast, he called me and he said, Dovie. First time he'd ever called me by his mama's name. You see, we followed that tradition that so many people do, not only in our indigenous traditions, but globally. I've met people who in their culture will only have one person carrying a name in a lifetime. While my grandma was alive, she was Dovie. I couldn't be Dovie while yet she breathed, but she made sure I got that name. Maybe she'd seen so much pass away. She wanted to be sure that name carried on. And so after Dad gave me this news, as only my dad could without telling me, you know, he sent me a picture of Grandma. In that picture, she was younger than me. She was younger than I could imagine her ever being. And her hair was done in some fancy early 20th century, late 19th century thing with pins and clips and twists. And she was wearing an elegant dress with a big wide sash. I could see it was an important dress, an important event. And it was her last day at the school, her graduation. After 4 years now, she was ready for a career working in someone else's house as a housekeeper. On the back it said simply, Dove, Lawton, Oklahoma. That's my grandma, my best friend, my first and greatest teacher. With her gone, I didn't know how I was going to carry on. I had no idea. I could not imagine a world without her in it. I couldn't imagine that arbor being torn down by new owners. I couldn't imagine food not cooked on that stove. And so I looked around and I grabbed on to the only other rock in my world. That was my dad. I decided I was going to be a daddy's girl. You're with me on this, aren't you? Mm-hmm. For the rest of my life, I was going to be a daddy's girl. It was very simple. He was used to really, really loving someone who was named Dovie, and I was stepping up. I was going to be her, and it would just be me and my dad, and Grandma would be with us as long as I carried her name. But life doesn't work out the way you expect, or maybe it works out exactly like you know it's going to. Seasons come and go, faster and faster. And then one day I got the news that my dad was gone. He'd sat down in California after coming out of the woods. Dad had left Texas, you see. He'd left Texas because it had gotten settled again. This time by folks from the north. He said, Texas has gotten so bad, you can't spit without hitting a Boston banker. I'm out of here. And he did. He went out and squatted on land in the Sierra Nevadas, somebody's land, his land, somebody else's land. He just stayed on that land, trout fishing and panning for gold, until one day he went into town and visited a friend and said to him, I could just about die for a glass of iced tea. And by the time his friend come back with that tea, that's what he'd done. Gone. Within a month or two after that, I got news that my mother had died. My mother, Well, she was scarce in memory to me. We had been separated. I always thought separated. That's what we call divorce, or the step before divorce. We had been separated. I didn't get divorced, but they did, and so I just got separated. When I was 2, I hadn't known my mother most of my life. I'd found her just as I was starting college, trying to reconcile, trying to put together that family I wanted, but my mother wasn't ready for that. My mother wasn't ready for the truth that was needed for our reconciliation. And now she was gone. All my hopes of a family gone. A generation, 2 generations stripped away, and all I could feel was that I was alone and that I was somehow next. I was an orphan. Now, you know, to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be corrected, there is no Indigenous people who have a word for that. Orphan. Childless, familyless person. If you lose a bloodline, you simply get another family. Children are collectively in relation in a community. In Lakota, when we're talking about grandchildren, we call them takoja. When we're talking about young people, we call them takoja. They're young people. They're everybody's. And yet, I had nobody. I was orphaned. I was gutted by it. And I was living in New England. Even the land was foreign. Now, I don't know if you know New England. Let me describe it from my point of view. It is far too green. It's unnerving. It has a disconcerting habit of going up and down. I don't know why. I need a land that stretches out. I need a land where I can see, where your eyes can stretch. I need a land that behaves itself. I need a land that doesn't have all these hills and all that water. It makes people wasteful. I was orphaned from the very land. I had no family. I used to walk along the beaches. I stared out at the ocean. At least it stayed flat. And I could almost dry it up and see prairie. I'd comfort myself by curling my tongue the way my dad taught me to. I won't try to do it now. It would be bad for the mic, and it never works when you want it to. You curl your tongue, if you're one of those lucky people who can do it, and you blow out like you're trying to you can make a dove call that comforts a lonely mother. When a dove is calling and calling, you make that call and they'll settle. And I made that call, yet I just couldn't settle. It was about that time I got a phone call. It was from a dear friend of mine. I hope you have a friend like her. She's one of those people who can laugh and cry at the same time. Over happy or sad things. Or food. She's from the pueblos in New Mexico. And when I heard her on the phone, for a second I could imagine a world where my heart didn't feel so sad. She laughed and cried and told me how sorry she was, asked how I was, knowing I was changed forever. And then she invited me to New Mexico. You have to come, she said. You really have to come. Come for Christmas. You know Christmas here. She's from the pueblos, and Christmas there is a special thing. I'd been there once before with 120 of her relatives, and I thought, I would feel worse surrounded by somebody else's family than being alone. I couldn't imagine that they were a loving, close family. It would be worse. And I told her, no, I'm really not ready. It's all the family. It's like, no, I'm sort of grieved. I'm just, and she said, stop it. You've had enough sadness, enough loss. Come on down here. Come on down here. And I said, no, I really, really, really can't. And she said, scared? Of what? I said, and she said, big bad Apache. Mm-hmm. Scared of a bunch of Pueblo people. Mm-hmm. Now I chuckled a little. It's an old rivalry. We really haven't had a good fight in 100 years. But I wasn't convinced that I could go. Until her next word, she said, well, okay, guess you're going to miss the baby. Baby? You are not. And she said, oh, me? Oh, my gosh, no. Too old. No baby for me. And I went, your daughter? And she went, no, too young, not my girl. And I said, your niece? And I started naming all the girls I knew of childbearing age in that community, especially ones related to her. And she started laughing, and she said, gotcha. I was on the plane. Now, when I got there, I was real curious, but I was well trained by my grandmother. My grandmother taught me, don't go into any situation asking questions. If you ask questions, you may get the answer to what you asked. You may not get the answer to what you didn't know to ask. Just watch and wait and listen. And so I watched, and I waited, and I listened, and I watched bellies mostly. Good thing I did not speak too much. I would embarrass myself horribly, because a few of her relatives had gained a few pounds since the last time I'd been there, and if I had, congratulated them on the coming child, it could have been awkward. It's hard to restrain yourself sometimes, so it is a virtue. I found that I could do so if I took one of her fresh-made tortillas, put in some carne seca. Now, if you don't know carne seca is jerked meat, usually deer. You take it, you crumble it up. The recipe's easy. You crumble it up, you throw it in the frying pan. We use butter, gift of Europe. You use a little butter. I'm grateful for that. Butter. And so you put a little butter, you put a little deer meat crumbled up, and then you put in the chiles. The chiles, no, you have to move fast. The fire has to be kind of high, but you got to move fast. They'll scorch fast. As soon as it's hot, roll it up in a fresh tortilla, stuff it in your mouth, and you won't embarrass yourself by talking when you shouldn't. I was eating a lot of carne seca during those early days of that Christmas visit, until anyone looking at me might have wanted to know when I was due to deliver. I couldn't keep that out of my mouth. I was bursting, needing to know, who was this baby? When was this baby coming? Christmas came and went. It came and went in that way that is unique to the Pueblos, and this Pueblo in particular, when the earth is turning back toward the sun. Stars on that mesa are so close, it feels like they could get tangled in your hair. The roads are lit with candles and lunch bags. For miles, you turn off your headlights and you can just drive, lit by the Milky Way and the luminarias. Piñon cookies. Good food, dancing. Christmas came and went, but there was no baby. My visit was drawing to an end. I thought, well, that's how it is with babies. They just come when they're unexpected and never come when you're ready. And so I'll go home and there'll be no baby. I was sitting in her kitchen having scrambled eggs and carne seca, hot tortillas. And she said, "You like those, don't you?" And I thought, "Yes, ma'am, I do. I like these just a bunch." And she said, "Well, you better make up another one because, well, we're going to be up all night tonight. That baby's coming." And I thought, "Oh, the baby's coming. How do we know that?" Here we are in one of the most ancient, continually inhabited places in North America, and we know the baby's coming today. And I thought, I bet that doctor is going to make that baby come today so he can have a holiday for the first of the year. Unnatural. But I didn't say a thing. I just rolled up another tortilla, stuck it in my pocket, and we loaded into the car, and we headed over toward her parents' house. Now, I thought we'd turn on the road toward the Indian Health Center, but we didn't. We turned on the other road. Well, it's the road after dirt roads. You know that one? Yeah. That's where her parents live, and we turned off that road, and I thought, oh, no. It's going to be a home delivery. Now, I never had one. Never had a child. I have a child, but I never had a birth. That happens too. And and I never wanted a home delivery, and I never wanted to attend one. I'm not interested in videos of them. And I didn't know how to get out of it. We pulled up on the packed caliche of her parents' front yard, and cars and trucks, mostly Jeeps and 4x and trucks were all there, lots of them covering the yard, and people were going in the front door. Now that's strange. I don't know how it is at your house, but I was raised that the only folks that use the front door are government. The mailman and the census man. People you want to talk to go to the kitchen door. Family and friends and neighbors. And yet we walked in the front door, and it got stranger. There was not a stick of furniture in the living room. It was all piled up down the hall between us and the bathroom. I was aware of my environment, and it was blockaded. You couldn't get there, so I drifted into the kitchen because, well, that's where you go. And the kitchen didn't smell like food, which is unusual for her mother. And there was nothing cooking. There was nothing on the table. Now, this is a table that always has piñon cookies, chili paste, and some oven bread or something out there. All that was on the table was a flower-printed traditional dress, a white lacy apron like a drift of snow, and a bowl of salt. And I thought, this is just so strange. I was ready to reach for the tortilla, but before I could stifle myself, her father said something in their language. It's a language I do not speak. And she smiled and looked at me, and she said, "We're getting started now." We went into the living room, and everybody settled down on the floor, all ages, babies and mother's arms and father's arms, and they got comfortable, and women started to lean into their men, their husbands, like rocks that they were, babies leaning into their mothers the same way. We found our place, and her dad knelt down there in front of all of us, but with his back to us, and he started doing things, and then he started singing. He sang in their language. As I said, I don't know a word of it. I didn't need to. I could tell what he was singing was holy. As he sang and sang, his voice, first trembling, seemed to get stronger and stronger the more he sang, and he just kept singing. He kept singing. People started drifting off to sleep. People settled into each other. Babies squirmed and then relaxed, and he kept singing. He didn't take a sip of water that I noticed, and he sang all night long. The night was near ending when my friend turned to me and said, "Come now, come. She looked at her father. Something was communicated between them. She said, "Come now, come. The sun is coming. We got to go outside." And so her mother and father, and then she and I, and then all the rest of us just filed out. And the sun was just starting to touch those sandstone cliffs. It was that pink and purple golden sunrise. This morning's looked a bit like it here. And the sun, as it started to peek over, I turned and looked. I didn't have any idea what was going on. Her father touched my forehead, and then he said something in their language. It sounded like the sad call of a dove. Tears filled my eyes. I didn't know why. I looked at my friend. I was about to ask. I couldn't stand it anymore, even if it meant my manners were gone. I looked at her, my question on my face, and she laughed and cried as only she can, and said, "You're the baby. You're the baby. I'm your sister now. Hug your papa. Hug your mama. You got family." I hugged her mom. I hugged her dad. Now my mom and dad. And her daddy laughed and cried, and I saw where she got it from. Later that night, we were sitting up high on the mesa in the old home. We were eating chili pork, tortillas. I was wearing a traditional flowered dress with a eyelet lacy apron. I felt like I was maybe 5, but in fact I was younger. I was newborn. I was afraid of spilling on my new good clothes, the dress, traditional dress my mama and sisters had made for me, for the baby, the new baby. I looked at them, and they could see the question on my face. And besides, I think I even asked. I figured if I'm newborn, then I can be ignorant. It's allowed. It's innocent. And she said, "Daddy says your grandma named you good. You'll still be called Dove. Your grandma named you good. And besides, you're Apache. We got to make it easy for you to remember it." Mm-hmm. Mama had a different explanation. She said, "It's hard to lose your parents when you think you're growed up." I was just in my 40s. It's hard to lose your parents when you think you're growed up, because you're not. And that might just be when you need them old people more than ever before. And then she told me stories, and I was home. I had a family. Thanks. Thank you.